Hello and welcome to this Good Friday edition of my Through the Bible in 10 Years podcast and video. And we're looking at today Mark 15. I'm videoing this for Good Friday 2024. Sunday is Easter. It's Friday, but Sundays are coming, as Tony Campolo used to say. But today we want to look at Mark 15. And immediately the high priest and the whole Sanhedrin, having taken counsel early with the elders and scribes, having bound Jesus, they brought him and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" And Jesus answering says to him, "You've said it." Now, if you remember, at the end of chapter 14, they arrested Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. They've taken him, they've interrogated him. They got Jesus to admit that he was the Son of humanity, the Son of Man, and that they would see him coming on the clouds. This is what they were looking for, of course. They were looking for some sort of a acknowledgement that he was the Messiah. And having gotten that, they take him to Pilate. They don't have the authority to put him to death. That would require the Roman governor's approval. And so they have secured evidence that he is an insurrectionist. And so they take him to the Roman governor Pilate. And Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "Well, you said so." Now, as far as I could tell, this seems to be an idiom. Thou sayest, you say. It seems to be agreeing with them. I mean, it's a little bit shy, maybe, of an outright agreement, but it's generally, you said it. You know, it's an agreement of sorts, but it is a little. I mean, it's like, just say yes, man. But probably it wasn't considered appropriate etiquette to say yes outright. But anyway, you said it. Now, verse 3, and the chief priests were accusing Jesus of many things, and Pilate was asking him again, "Are you not going to answer anything to all these things that these priests are saying? See what sort of things they're accusing you of." Verse 5, but Jesus no longer answered anything. And Pilate was amazed. I mean, aren't you going to defend yourself? Aren't you going to get desperate? Aren't you going to get down on your knees and beg? Nope, he's not going to. He's already said, "You've said it," and that's all he's going to say. He's not going to lower himself. For one thing, he's not going to lower himself to respond to these things. But on the other hand, he knows what his destiny is. His destiny is not to escape. His destiny is to die as a ransom for many. By the way, we're looking at my explanatory notes on Mark's Passion Week, if you're watching the video part. Barabbas, verse 6. Now at the feast, Passover, Pilate was going to release to them one prisoner, whoever they would request, verse 7, and there was one by the name of Barabbas, who had been bound along with other revolutionaries. He committed murder in his revolt. This is a bad guy. He may have thought he had ways to justify it, but he wasn't a good guy. Pilate doesn't seem to be too bothered to release him. It's kind of like he's a little gnat here, Barabbas. You'll end up dead eventually anyway. We can let you go today. We'll murder you tomorrow or put you to death tomorrow. Pilate doesn't seem to be bothered, and Pilate seems to think that they'll pick Jesus. That the people will pick Jesus. Okay, so these leaders, they're annoyed, but the people will pick Jesus for release, surely. Verse 8, and the crowd, having gone up, they began to ask Pilate, as he was doing to them normally, to release somebody. Verse 9, and Pilate, by the way, the Greek is, the English is very wooden because I've tried to give you a window into the structure of the Greek. Verse 9, and Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you wish that I released you the king of the Jews?" Now, Pilate doesn't actually believe he's the king of the Jews. He's being sarcastic. Verse 10, for he knew that because of jealousy, the high priest had handed him over. So Pilate's like, well, they're going to pick Jesus, of course. This Barabbas guy, he's a bad guy. But that's not what happens, of course. He doesn't get released. Verse 11, but the high priest stirred up the crowd so that he might release to them rather Barabbas. It's easy to find some people to, you can always find some people to heckle. It's the nice people who are quiet, right? But the high priest stirred up the crowd. Verse 12, Pilate, again answering, is saying, "What do you want me to do with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Apparently, there is, I get the impression that there was support for Jesus' Messiah among the people, that this was a fairly common thing, right? Pilate doesn't care. Pilate doesn't consider Jesus a threat. Pilate says, what do you want me to do with him? Verse 13, and they cried again, crucify him. Verse 14, and Pilate was saying to them, well, what did he do? What evil did he do? But they cried even more, crucify him, crucify him. Of course, some of it is planted, right? The high priests have planted people. Some of it is maybe buyer's remorse, because, I believed you were the Messiah, but look at you, you're not. I feel betrayed. People get very angry when they feel like they've been taken advantage of, or when they think they've been fooled. It's almost better that you not have had any engagement with them at all than that you prove them to be wrong about something that they believed in. Buyer's remorse. That could be part of it too. Crucify him, crucify him. They're upset with him. Or maybe they're upset that he didn't fight. There are probably multiple reasons why this crowd feels the way that it does. But part of it is the people that want him crucified are the people that are there. Verse 15, and Pilate and the people who don't want him to be crucified are probably being quiet, right? If you've got a murderous person next to you wanting to put people to death, you will think twice about saying, I don't think we should crucify him, because then you're going to get beat up. And so, this is in a violent mob. You don't say, no, let's talk about this, guys. And not unless you just really have a death wish or you feel on the principle of the thing. Verse 15, and Pilate, wishing to make the crowd satisfied, he released Barabbas to them. And having beat him, having scourged Jesus, he delivered Jesus so that he might be crucified. So Pilate hands Jesus over. The crucifixion, verse 16. This is about 9 in the morning when the crucifixion begins. And the soldiers led him away outside of the palace, that is the praetorium. And they called together the whole Roman cohort. And verse 17, they dressed Jesus in purple. They wove a thorny crown. They placed it on him. So they're basically mocking him. Here's the king, he got a crown of thorns. That's a crown, right? Purple robe. Verse 18, and they began to greet him. Greetings, King of the Jews. Verse 19, and they struck his head with a reed. They spat on him. Getting on their knees, they were giving him homage, which is, of course, very, sarcastic in the highest degree. Verse 20, when they'd mocked him, they stripped him of the purple. They put his garments on him, and they led him out that they might crucify him. This is humiliating. This is shameful. Jesus knows that this is the cup. He knew that this was the cup that he was going to have to drink, and he drinks it. So, verse 21, let me get the screen up here. And they forced a certain Simon of Cyrene as he was passing by, coming from the country. By the way, he's the father of Alexander and Rufus, so that Simon might take up his cross. This mention of Alexander and Rufus, I think, suggests that this family became believers. This had an impact on them. And they are among the believers even to the day of the writing of Mark, apparently. Verse 22, and they bring Jesus to Golgotha, which is being translated the place of a skull. Verse 23, and they were giving him wine mixed with myrrh, which is meant to kind of deaden his, is a mercy thing, right? Kind of deaden his senses, which he did not receive. So he's not taking any alleviation of the pain that he is about to experience. By the way, there's, where is this? I've got a picture here, if you're watching the video, of Gordon's tomb. Gordon was a British soldier who in the 1800s, he saw this and he think, well, that looks like a skull. I wonder if this is what, and there was a garden nearby and there was a tomb nearby. And he thought, oh, maybe this is where Jesus actually was crucified. Now, let me just say that I often feel that a lot of people don't have a good sense of historical perspective. For example, in this case, how much has happened for Gordon, in 1800 plus years, a lot has happened. And so to think, oh, there's a garden here, that's not the question. Was there a garden here 2,000 years ago? And actually, even the city walls of Jerusalem today, you might say, well, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is inside the city walls, and we know that Jesus was crucified outside the city walls. Well, archaeology has shown that the current location of the city walls is not where the walls were 2,000 years ago. That, in fact, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is today is outside where the city walls were then. So most scholars, I would say the majority of scholars, but maybe even the solid extreme majority of scholars, think that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the more likely location where Jesus was actually crucified. Now, maybe Gordon's tomb gives us a better feel. I mean, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is so churchified that you don't get a good feel for it, for what it was like back then. Gordon's tomb probably gives you a much better feel for what it was like back then. But in terms of which was the more likely location, evidence has shown that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a location that has been a place of veneration for a long, long time, probably going back at least to Constantine in the 300s. So Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the likely location. And the only reason why we even question this is probably because we lack a certain historical sense of historical depth perception, so to speak, and how much things change in 2,000 years. Anyway, but I do have a picture of Gordon's tomb here and the rock formation that Gordon thought looked like a skull. So the crucifixion begins at about 9 in the morning, the third hour. Verse 24, they crucify him, they divide his garments, they cast lots on them for who would take what. Verse 25, it was about the third hour, and they crucified him. And the inscription, verse 26, and the inscription of the charge that it had been inscribed, the King of the Jews. Now, of course, in the other Gospels, we are not surprised to find that the Jewish leaders don't like this. It's humiliating, right? This is what happens to kings of the Jews, in effect, Pilate is saying. He's having a good old time, isn't he? He's just, probably doesn't even remember, the day after what's happening here. Verse 27, and with him he crucified 2 thugs, one on his right hand and one on his left. By the way, notice that there is no mention of one of them coming to believe. It's a reminder that that's in Luke. If all we had were Mark or Matthew, we would assume that both of the criminals remained suspicious of or mocking of Jesus. But anyway, so he's crucified along with people who are really thieves and who are really criminals. Verse 29, and those passing by were insulting Jesus, wagging their heads and saying, "Woe, the one who destroys the temple and rebuilds it in 3 days. Save yourself." Verse 30, come down from the cross. Similarly, the high priest, mocking to one another with the scribes, were saying, he saved others, he isn't able to save himself. Verse 32, let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we might see and believe. And the ones who had been crucified him were also reviling him. Both of them, Mark suggests. Note that people were crucified on the way into the city. So they crucified people right by the gate that entered into the city, one of the gates, so that people would see. This is what happens to people who mess with the Romans. Don't mess with the Romans or you'll end up like this. And so people coming into the city are going to see him and the others crucified there, and they're mocking him. This idea that he destroys the temple and rebuilds it in 3 days, Mark doesn't actually record Jesus ever saying that. John does in John chapter 2, I believe it is. But anyway, it is quite possible that Jesus said it in some form or another, because it is the assumption of Mark's gospel, at least here, that Jesus said it, or at least that people thought he said it, right? People thought he said it. But they didn't understand what he meant by it. What he meant by it, of course, is, that he would die, and then that would be the destruction of the temple, as it were. And we will see the temple curtain rip in two when Jesus dies, and then he rebuilds it when he rises from the dead. Verse 33, and the 6th hour having come, this is noon, it became dark over the whole land until about the 9th hour, 3 p.m. Verse 34, And in the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which translated is, my God, why have you abandoned me? Now, this is a quote from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? We shouldn't think that God turns away from him because he's taking on our sins. There's nothing in the text that says anything like that. God is everywhere present at all times. God is there. Jesus just isn't feeling it at that particular moment. And I know of someone right now who's their family is going through a bit of a crisis, and there are comments on Facebook about feeling silence. Now, they know that God is with them. They believe that God is with them. They have faith that God is with them. But it doesn't necessarily feel like God is there right now. It feels like God is silent in their struggle. And no doubt, this is how Jesus feels. He doesn't feel the presence of God the Father. He feels. Again, I'm mentioning feeling. We often know things with our heads and don't feel it in our heart. When I was in my teens, I knew with my head that God loved me, but I didn't feel like God loved me. And at this particular moment, Jesus doesn't feel God's love. He feels abandoned by God on the cross. And he quotes the Psalm, right? Psalm 22. And there are, of course, other parts of this Psalm that connect to Jesus on the cross. By the way, this is not likely something that someone would make up Jesus saying. This has the ring of historicity to it, that Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me, from the cross. Verse 35, and some of those who were standing alongside, when they heard him, they said, look, he's calling for Elijah. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Now, no doubt this was a slurred. I mean, I've not been crucified, thankfully. I hope I never get crucified. But I imagine you don't talk a lot when you're on a cross. And so even though we know he's quoting Psalm 22, it may not have sounded distinct or clear to the people standing there. Eloi, Eloi. I'm not even going to try to imitate it, but they might have thought, oh, he's calling for Eli, for Elijah, because, of course, Elijah was supposed to come before the Lord. Verse 36, and a certain man running, having filled a sponge with sour wine, he put it on a reed, and he was offering Jesus to drink, saying, wait. And then they said, don't do it. Wait, let's see if Elijah will come and take him down. Just three stooges here among the crowd. Verse 37, but Jesus, having let go a great sound, he breathed out. And so Jesus dies prematurely, really. Crucifixion is basically eventual drowning in your own fluids, and suffocation. We read in the other gospel that Pilate is surprised that he's dead so soon. And it's often said that Jesus died of a broken heart. And I think that makes an awful lot of sense. But anyway, verse 38, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. This signifies, of course, according to Hebrews, that the way into the Holy of Holies is now open for all of us. We don't have to go through a priest. We don't have to go through a temple. Jesus has gone into God's presence for us. We have direct access to the presence of God. Verse 39, the centurion standing in front of him, having seen that he'd breathed out like this, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. Now, interestingly, the centurion is the very first person in the Gospel of Mark who sees the connection between Jesus being the Son of God and Jesus dying for his sins. Now, there have been other human beings who have realized that Jesus was the Son of God. Peter in Mark 8 confesses that Jesus is the Son of God. But then when Jesus begins to talk about him going to Jerusalem to die, Peter's like, no, wait a minute here, Jesus. You're a winner. You're not going to die. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. So Peter doesn't get the connection that part of Jesus being the Messiah is dying for the sins of the world. James and John don't get it. Hey, can we sit on your right and left hand, Jesus, in your kingdom? One throne here, one throne there. And Jesus is like, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I'm about to drink? And they're like, yeah, give me a cup. I can drink the cup. But they don't understand he's talking about his death. And then one more time in Mark, They're all talking about who's going to be greatest in the kingdom. I'm going to be Secretary of the Treasury. Judas says, I'm going to be the Secretary of State. I'm going to be the ambassador to India, Thomas said. Not really. But basically, and Jesus is like, you guys don't get it. I'm going to Jerusalem to die. And so it is the centurion, ironically, not even a Jew, who first sees that Jesus' death is a ransom for the sins of the world, that in Jesus' death, his messianic identity is most fully understood. And if you know the Gospel of Mark, one of the features of the Gospel of Mark is the so-called messianic secret, the idea that Jesus is constantly telling people not to say he's the Messiah, and he commands the demons not to tell anybody that he's the Holy One of Israel. And part of why he does that, perhaps, is because they just didn't understand what a Messiah was going to be. Though the people couldn't see what Messiah ought to be. As Amy Grant used to sing, El Shaddai, El Shaddai. Anyway, so it is a Roman centurion, and of course the Gospel of Mark may very well have been written in Rome for Roman Christians, Gentile Christians. Probably was written to Gentile Christians because in Mark 7, Mark has to explain what Jews do. Well, Jews know what Jews do, so he must be writing to people who aren't Jews. And so it is very significant that the very first person who gets it in Mark, this is the climax of the Gospel of Mark, by the way. The climax is Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the King. Jesus is the Son of God. And what reveals it more than anything else? His crucifixion, his death, his righteous death. So this is the climax of the Gospel of Mark, right here in verse 39. Truly, this man was the Son of God, this centurion says. And I think, is it Ben-Hur? I'm trying to remember what. Anyway, there's a novel written about that. Okay, verse 40. And women were watching from afar, among were Mary Magdalene. By the way, she was never a prostitute, never identified as a prostitute anywhere in the New Testament. Mary, the mother of James the Less, Joseph, and Salome, who were following, verse 41, who were following him when he was in Galilee, and they were serving him alongside many others who came up with him to Jerusalem. Interesting that women were part of his followers. They were his disciples too. A disciple's a follower. There were more disciples than just the 12, and there were women who were his followers as well. In Luke, we find out that these women actually did most of the material support of Jesus' ministry. How did Jesus eat? How did Jesus live? How did he survive in a very mundane physical sense? Well, the women were taking care of them, apparently, according to the Gospel of Luke. But they're watching from afar, and that will become significant because they will, of course, be the first ones to witness the resurrection on Sunday morning. Verse 42, and it already having become evening, since it was the preparation, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, verse 43, a prominent council member, who also was awaiting the kingdom of God, having dared to enter to Pilate, even asked for the body of Jesus. Verse 44, and Pilate marveled that he'd already died. And calling for the centurion, he asked if he'd already died. Verse 45, and having known from the centurion, he gave the corpse to Joseph. So Joseph of Arimathea is like Nicodemus, one of the few who they're not making a lot of, they're not talking about it that much, but they're expecting the kingdom of God. They quietly agree with John the Baptist, quietly agree with Jesus, and Joseph of Arimathea takes the body of Jesus. Verse 46, and having bought a linen, having taken him down, he wrapped him in the linen. But I assume it's not nightfall yet. It's getting that direction. But I assume it's not, because then it would be the Sabbath. Having bought a linen, having taken him down, he wrapped him in the linen, placed him in a tomb that had been hewn out of rock. There are tombs, by the way, around. If you go downstairs in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there are even some tombs down in the bottom of it. And he rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Verse 47, and Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, were watching where he had been put. And that is where, by the way, this is a picture I took. If you're watching the video, this is a picture I took in the bottom of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It doesn't exactly sound like the picture of the tomb in, say, John, because you have an angel at the head and an angel. It'd be kind of cramped in there for an angel to be back here. I'm a little angel, But anyway, there are tombs in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And thus Jesus is in the grave, but he will not stay in the grave. This is Good Friday. Jesus died as a ransom for our sins. Mark 10:45 says, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And that's where we'll leave off today in Through the Bible on this Good Friday.